Welcome all. It is 1 o'clock here in Chicago, and it is a joy to welcome you to Getting Retirement Right, our conversation with visionary entrepreneur and best-selling author Rick Smith. We are thrilled to welcome you on behalf of the Leadership and Society Initiative, a new endeavor here at the University of Chicago that supports distinguished leaders in designing meaningful next chapters for themselves and for society. The core of the Leadership and Society Initiative is a fellowship here on our campus in Hyde Park, where you go deep into knowing yourself better and your values at this stage of life, really thinking about the big issues in the world that you care about, and then imagining how you want to activate a next chapter of purpose for society. Alongside that fellowship, we have many public opportunities where we engage people that have inspired us as we've been designing LSI to share their voice more publicly with a broader community. And that is exactly what this event is entitled to do. And with us today, and I'm going to take down my screen here so we can see our guest of honor, is Rick Smith. Rick is an entrepreneur, connector, author, and speaker with an eclectic range of accomplishments. He is one of the few leaders who has founded two companies in two completely separate industries, which have surpassed $1 billion in value. Quite a feat. He is also a national best-selling author of 3 books and one potentially to come in the very area that we will be talking with him about. He's graced the TED stage among many others, and we are grateful for him to grace our virtual stage here at the University of Chicago. Perhaps most relevant of all, he has recently founded and now serves as CEO of the Onyx Group, a groundbreaking membership organization for the most respected leaders of our time, including Fortune 500 CEOs, a number of which are involved with LSI as well. And so, Rick, welcome. We are thrilled to have you and really grateful for the chance to be in conversation with you today.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Well, so Rick, I'd love to jump in, and as we shared in advance of this talk, you wrote a really powerful piece in HBR. But before you wrote it, you had dozens of conversations with CEOs and distinguished leaders as they prepared to engage in their longstanding careers. And I want to ask, before we jump into your article, which expresses how people should address these challenges, I want to start with why this period, even for the most accomplished individuals, can be so challenging.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and just a little bit of background. So I've done a couple things through my career with retired Fortune 500 CEOs, and then most recently, a couple years ago, had an opportunity to engage on a retainer and basically have a ton of discussions. I think I talked to over 100 retired CEOs in the period of about a year. And what sparked all of this interest in this area was all those discussions were very similar, which is everything's great. I'm spending a little bit more time with my family and my grandkids and those things. And eventually you get to, a but. And the but is, most of my professional network and relationships were within my company, particularly for those that spent a predominance of their career in one company. And now that's a little bit off limits, or it's vastly dissipated. I'm trying to rebuild a new network, which is difficult. Secondly, I'm spending a lot more time with my spouse, and I would love to integrate them into the things that I'm doing and I'm interested in. And the opportunities to do that are not, always front and center. And then finally, most people find their way, but managing a portfolio life is difficult, and it's very different than the pathway that most of these people have focused on in their careers, where you're at one company, one big brand, there's 3 or 4 priorities for the next 18 months, and it's pretty easy to kind of filter your time and attention in those areas where you all of a sudden you're retired and it's a blank canvas. It's a lot more challenging in a number of ways.
Well, it's really interesting. When we were designing the Leadership and Society Initiative, we were trying to better understand this challenge. And there was someone who said, I feel like I lost my identity, my purpose, and my community all at once as I finished this longstanding career. And, they loved being a parent and a spouse and a grandparent, but part of their identity was in that company. They loved that world of family, but a big part of their purpose was, this impact in the world that they felt. And then, a big part of their community was both in their company and then around, all the people that they collaborated with and worked with. And I just thought that was a really good summation. And they said everything that I had imagined in retirement came true. I had all this time with family that I love, but what I hadn't realized were the things that I might lose that I hadn't really built a plan to replace. And so I thought that was, anyway, very instructive for us as we thought about our work, and sounds very similar to what you're describing in your conversations. Well, so you
And
didn't
I would
just,
just say, I
yeah,
would add to that, I think that, all of those things that are lost can be rebuilt in
right.
potentially a more satisfying way, but it takes knowledge, it takes a plan, it takes a lot of effort that a lot of people are surprised by.
Well, and I'll just share, one example who's on our advisory board, and I know in Onyx, Ann Mulcahy, who is, CEO and chairman of Xerox, she talks about how, she found her most satisfying chapter being leading Save the Children afterward as the board president, and, using all of those incredible talents that she built as a business leader at the head of Xerox to really move forward children's rights and care in the world. So absolutely. Well, let's jump in, because you didn't just hear these stories and feel sympathy. You actually did something about it. You were able to theme them out and really provide a set of recommendations about how you address the challenges. And your article in HBR, it looks at how these challenges show up. And then you give what you call pro tips, which I just thought were, genius recommendations to individuals who are entering or even in this stage. And so the first thing that you write about is how looking through the lens of the present impedes you from seeing future possibilities. And I've seen that a lot, but maybe you could describe a little bit about what that looks like. Why is the present lens impeding you? And then how do you overcome it, especially if you're in the case, which I think you're describing here, of currently being in your role, but maybe it's going to end, but you can't quite see into that future yet. Let's just dive into that challenge and your recommendation accordingly.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is most of the decisions that you've made, either long-term strategically or on a day-to-day basis while you're working full-time, are within a pretty finite lens. Is this going to help my career? Am I going to have a positive impact? Does this help my organization, et cetera? And all of a sudden you can do anything that you want, but the lens is open, open much wider, and it makes it a lot harder to make decisions. So for example, you don't have to make money anymore. You don't have to do something that's considered prestigious. If you have the opportunity to kind of reset your identity in a lot of ways, and then figure out, okay, what does success look like? How is it measured in that new identity, which will lead you to a completely new set of filters and lenses through which you can make decisions. And what you often see is, oh, I'm going to retire. If you're particularly at this, very prominent executive level, what are the things that people like me mostly do? Which is you immediately join 2 or 3 boards. You may or may not do some work directly with a private equity company. There's just a stable of things that people kind of fall right into, versus taking the time and stepping back and saying, well, wait a minute, I actually don't have to do any of that stuff. Is adding 3 boards, I don't need the money anymore. Is it going to bring me joy? Is it going to fill up my calendar in ways that are obstructive? Like, just really going through that thought process of, stepping back 5 steps to say, how do I want this to look? What are the definitions of success, and how are the lenses that I'm going to create to go make those decisions?
It's so interesting, because I think you're describing something that David Brooks, who's a faculty member in the Leadership Inside Initiative, talks about a lot, which is that at this stage, you go from having extrinsic motivations be a primary source of driving you. So even though you get into your career because you care deeply about the company, you care deeply about the move that you're, making for society within that company potentially, there's a very strict accountability framework around that structure. So if you're the CEO of Xerox, to come back to that example, yes, Anne loves people. She built the company because she loved the people inside of it. She came up through that lens. But then as you get into that CEO role, you've got earnings calls and you've got, a lot of external accountability, and it kind of gives you a guide. Okay, so you started with this motivation, but now you have a guide of exactly what you need to be in order to be the best CEO of a public company. And what David describes is that it's really hard if you've been successful in that environment for sometimes 30 or 40 years to even remember how to be guided almost entirely by your intrinsic motivations, right? It's not that you don't have those motivations, not that they haven't been present, but they haven't been leading necessarily because this extrinsic structure is so strong that it's given you a lot of answers over the time of building your career. And so anyway, in his book, The Second Mountain, it's a lot about the first mountain someone else has constructed. And it's very hard after you've climbed a mountain someone else has constructed to figure out, how do I invent a mountain now? How do I figure out, what my mountain is? And so just affirming what you're saying. And I think that may be getting at that idea of how do you get out of that presentist context where you have a certain structure and really tune in. I'll just share that in our world, one of the things that's been really interesting is to use the liberal arts, to read, Aristotle and Plato and some of these other thinkers, and to, review these questions of why am I here? What's my purpose? What kind of values do I want to leave? And to use that almost as a way to escape the moment and return to some of those big picture questions. So really interesting.
Yeah. I would just add that it's, you have to be open to that reset, but it's not enough to go through a 3-week process and reinvent yourself and say, all right, now here's who I am and here's what I'm going to want to do. So much of this requires experimentation. Becomes much more like the entrepreneurial process where you have hypotheses and you just need to go test it. Let me dive in let me get on a deal team in a private equity firm and see, do I actually like it? Do I like being around those personalities of people? Do I like the outcomes? Is the money that you make important or not? Like all of those things you can learn through small, what I push people toward is more risk-free experimentation to see, okay, hey, I've reset myself. These are the lenses I think I'm going to make decisions on, but I'm going to go through an experimentation phase and really understand how comfortable am I with free time? How important are the nonprofit and those types of things? How does my religion factor into all? Like people don't really know until you start to live it in a significant way.
Well, so another challenge that you raise in this piece is that a wealth of options can overwhelm and paralyze decision-making. And you reference this a little bit, but I'd love to dig deeper into this idea that at this moment in life, choices are endless. But as we know from a lot of behavioral economics, choice anxiety is very real. That, in some ways we could be happier being told, okay, here's what it takes to be a good CEO than being told, there are an endless number of possibilities for this stage of life. So, talk a little bit about that challenge and then how you recommend people addressing that.
Yeah, I think the first thing is if you really look back at your successful career, and that could be kind of at any level, most of it is very reactionary. The recruiters call you, the opportunities come to you, your organization says, hey, we're thinking about promoting you or moving you, to this other area. And so even though you feel like you're managing your career, it's within a very tight funnel of decisions that are, that are made for you, as well as the, the business decisions you make. We've already got a brand. Here's the way that we would typically do this. People bring you fully baked ideas, and your gut reaction as a general manager is, okay, analyze, make the decision, and move on. And then all of a sudden, you can go for 2 months every year to Europe and live in a different country. And what does that feel like? And what are the implications of doing that? And do I even want to do that? Do I want to spend that time with my spouse? Like, or I can join a board, and is this the right board to join, or am I selling out too early and there's a better one coming along? I mean, I think there's so many of these, or do I want to do anything at all? I just finally met the unicorn CEO who said, all I want to do is retire for like a year or so. And she literally said she slept until 10 or 11 in the morning for 2 months straight and just had nothing on her agenda, and is having a great time now, kind of filling some things in. But you literally can structure it any way you want. And in a lot of cases, you have people that are afraid to do anything. And I think like, and you hear, one of the biggest risks that I've seen is the most common piece of advice is don't do anything for 6 months. Don't make any commitments for 6 months. And what happens to so many people is they artificially push off any activity to the point that their heads explode, and they then say, all right, I got to get back, I got to do something. And they in a lot of cases will accept roles that have long-term commitments that are very hard to get out of, or they accept the wrong role versus trying to sort of blend yourself into what that new life portfolio looks like.
Well, I will say, I mean, underneath that idea is something that was core in our design for LSI. We have people here on campus for a full academic year, typically just after they're finished with their longstanding career. And one of the blessings, and this was something that we heard from people as we were architecting it, is that it gives people something very meaningful and immersive, and it allows them to be very planful. So they're not in that artificial stage where they're just like going crazy with, I know I shouldn't do anything for 6 months, but I can't sit still. They're doing things, but those things are not long-term commitments. They're designing their purpose plan and they're thinking about what they want to do next. And so it gives you this marriage of immersion, which I think many people feel like they need because they've lost so much and they want to be in a community with a purpose, but it doesn't tie your hands in the sense of, now immediately I'm going to go from one set of handcuffs in a certain sense of that word to another. Right. And so it's a really interesting observation that you want to be balanced, and the cold turkey is not necessarily an easy option either for people in terms of just what their needs are as humans who have been in a world with constant stimulation.
Yeah. Well, we too have so in Onyx, Alan Mullally, Ginny Romedy. I mean, these are people that their phones will continue to ring as long as they leave their phones on, right? They are getting these inbound opportunities consistently. So even if you wanted to fall back and say, hey, I'm more comfortable just evaluating the things that are coming at me, for most people, and even I would say even CEOs of below the Fortune 500, you're CEO of a chemical company or you're a head of an ad agency or something, very successful, but the phone really does stop to ring. And so not only you have this mosaic you have to create on your own, you now have to go hunt, relearn the skills of building your pipeline of opportunities. Because if you just wait for the things that come at you, it's, almost by definition is a suboptimal list of things that you're choosing from.
Well, so I've got a couple more questions, but we want to get questions from the group. So please feel free to begin chatting them in so we can bring them to Rick. You talk a lot in the article, Rick, about the network and that you cannot just rely on your existing network because you may want to go in new directions. And in order to do that, right, you may need other people in your world who allow you to see it and be it. And so can you talk a little bit about the challenge that you outline, which is relying on your old network can distract you from the critical task of building a new one, and then maybe address how do you build a new one at this stage of life?
Yeah, so I think this is something that probably everybody on the call has experienced, which is your network atrophies really quickly when you truly retire. I consistently hear 95% of the people that I thought were my, personal relationships turned out to be very transactional. And as soon as I don't look like I add value, they stop calling. Like they can't get anything from me, and they stop calling. And I think that's hard enough to take as phase one. Phase two is if you go through this process of what do I really want to do? Where do I really want to contribute? It often leads you to something that's very different than, I was at IBM and my network of people in IBM helped me get new jobs and be effective and all that stuff. Well, you're not trying to be effective in a large organization anymore. So those networks aren't nearly as helpful. A.G. Lafley has switched entirely toward, how do I help communities become effective in organizing and moving the needle in their own communities? And to do that effectively is completely different set of people than he's ever worked with in his life. Jenny Romedy is now focused on, skills-based leadership and, which addresses a lot of social issues. The people that are going to move that needle forward are very different than the ones that sit on the boards with her or, some of the other things. And so I think that's part of it. Like anything with networking, you just got to put yourself out there. So the key, I think, is, can you find the activities that have a high likelihood of introducing you to people, organized serendipity that are going to be helpful in whatever you're trying to do. You can certainly do that in the nonprofit world. You can kind of identify those networks. What I've found also, though, the challenge is most people that I talk to that have been very successful, they don't want to know more people. They want to know the right people. And so is there a way you can find some type of curation mechanism where, this is the whole idea with Onyx, is that I'm going to put you in a room with 40 other people, and it doesn't matter who you sit next to, you're going to really get something out of that and probably spark something you might want to do together, in the future. So the more you can lean toward those, I think the better your hit rate.
We have a question in the chat that I think also is spoken about in your article, which is related to your observation that things that worked for you as an executive, that decisiveness, for example, that may not work for you at this stage of life. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about examples of what some of those traits are that might have worked really well in career, but that might not work at this stage of life, and how you overcome the cognitive dissonance you may have in breaking that habit as you enter this stage.
Yeah, I'll just give you a couple examples. I think, when you were young, I think most everybody on this call, was a hunter, right? You went out, you didn't wait for success to happen. You went out and made it happen. And the later you get, the more you move into general management or senior management roles, you become much more of a decider. You're evaluating, the ideas are fully baked by very smart people by the time they get to you. And then when you retire, you need to create your own life again. You need to become a hunter, and get some of those skills back. I think the other, the bigger the role and the bigger the company, you're making really major decisions. A lot of retirement is these entrepreneurial decisions of I think I've got a hypothesis that this might work and I want to go experiment with it. And I think those are different. Those are skills that you're just not used to, the muscles that you haven't worked in, in quite a while, that you've got to be comfortable. By the way, large corporations, you're like an outfielder. You drop one ball and everybody's pointing guns at you. Retirement's more like a batter, where if 3 of the 10 things you do turn out to be worth it, that's pretty good. And it's going to teach you a lot about, how to optimize my portfolio over a longer period of time. But you got to be comfortable saying, I signed up for this and that was a complete waste of time, or I thought I'd love it and I actually hate it. How do I get out of it and move myself in a new direction?
Yeah, or even lower percentages. Maybe it's soccer, and every 20 shots you take, finally one goes in the goal. Well, so another question in here. We've mentioned Onyx a few times, but not described it. Can you share more about the Onyx network that you've built, and maybe the why behind it, kind of the theory of change that you had as you designed it?
Yeah, I mean, it really came out of, this is my 6th company that I've started, which have all come out of, you see that there's clearly a need for something to exist in the market and it doesn't. Right. Here again, it comes back to all of these conversations where my network dissipates. I'm doing a lot more stuff with my spouses, and that's not presented on a silver platter for me. And how do I'm trying to manage a portfolio life, And boy, it feels like there's a lot of friction between what I want to do and the opportunities that are best suited for me. And so really it just hit me like, hey, I think I can't solve all these problems, but I can curate a phenomenal network. I can create just off the chart experiences that people want to go to with their spouses and integrate that network. And then on behalf of the group, we can go represent them to all of the top PE firms, to the top search firms. We get first look at board roles, those types of things, as well as, membership clubs around the world. We get free access for our members and things like, rare investment allocations, things like that. So that was really the idea behind it. It's been, I would say, even more of a need than we thought. We've gotten 50%, over 50% of the people who have been invited have joined
Wow.
the membership. It's, this is not meant to be a giant business. We're going to build, we're capping the membership at 100 in the US, and then the plan is to replicate it in Asia and Europe and Latin America. So you end up with 400 or 500 people around the world that are all peers in some way. Again, we're starting with Fortune 500, Fortune 250 CEOs, but it's really going to end up being a mosaic of people that are really interesting in a bunch of different walks of life, that we're building it out for. And part of it is, this is my 6th company. My wife says I am not allowed to start a 7th. And so I'm thinking, what if I'm going to move into a retirement phase, what better way than to host great meetings to which I would otherwise never be invited. So.
Well, so actually, Rick, it's a great segue to my final question for you in this conversation, which is, you've learned so much about this. I know you're even working on a book. How has this shaped your thinking about your own next chapter? What's a way in which all these conversations have maybe changed your own mindset about this stage of life?
So the biggest surprise for me has been, hey, if I go have lunch with A.G. Lafley, it's going to be a great discussion. Like, he's fascinating, super well accomplished. It's the second and third introductions that come after that are the most, are now becoming very common, where I was on the phone with a CEO this morning who signed up, who knows a woman who's probably the top winemaker in the world. And I think Michael Lewis, the author, is coming to one of our next dinners. Like, you just start getting introduced to not central casting business people, but who have this phenomenal impact in the world in very interesting ways. And it's almost like, how do I build my network? Well, I can do anything I want in retirement, but I can also create a network of fascinating people that I would never have run into in my previous course of career.
Well, I'll share, reading your article, among the many pieces I've kind of absorbed as we've been building Leadership and Society Initiative, that I've found all of this information to be liberating in a certain sense. So I'm in my mid 40s, and you have the sense, I think, at my stage that, oh, you get to a certain level, and then there's a floor beneath you, and then you just stay at that level even after you retire. And you begin to realize, oh, like, no matter where you get to, you're always just a person. And, those things, they get taken away. And you have to really think about, what am I building sustainably within myself that is my core purpose? And how do I see that transitioning, beyond any institution and just as part of my life cycle? And the reason that's liberating in some ways is because you then begin to absorb some of those second mountain activities. Now you begin to think about, okay, so what is that intrinsic motivation? How do I get in touch with that? And how do I make sure that I'm staying in touch, so that as I reach that moment, this transition isn't a cliff, it's more of a, off ramp from one on ramp to another. And so I found it to be fascinating. And I found your work on this to be extremely influential as we've thought about these issues. So thank you for your work in general. Thank you for speaking with us today. And I know I see many people that are nodding in appreciation on the Zoom as well. So look forward to continuing the conversation and see people chatting in with their gratitude too. Have a great afternoon, everyone. And Rick, thank you for your insights.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm at Rick Smith at onyxleaders.com. If anybody has any questions, happy to stay in touch.
Perfect. And we'll pass that on to everyone as well. Have good afternoons. Thank you, Rick.